Good evening, everyone. Today we are going to talk about the the new avant-garde literary culture of the 20th century, and we are going to look at how a new generation of poets and creative writers rejected much of the scientific philosophy that shaped academic institutions at the end of the 19th century, and how they argued that creative artistic work should portray inner visions and symbolic meanings rather than objective representations of the external world. Today's discussion will focus on the subjective themes in this kind of writing, this kind of avant garde, experimental kind of writing, which later influenced writers and artists throughout the 20th century. Today, we will refer specifically to avant garde authors who shaped the new literary themes of the 20th century. And these authors, these poets, are Charles Baudelaire, Stéphane Mallarmé, Arthur Rimbaud, and Villiers de l'Isle Adam. So, we are going to look at these four poets, and we should keep in mind that, in contrast to the naturalist writers, these poets wrote about personal symbols and artistic imagination instead of the social problems of modern societies. Okay, so a wide variety of new cultural movements challenged the popular late 19th century European faith in science, social progress, and rational liberalism. And philosophical radicals such as Friedrich Nietzsche challenged religious and ethical traditions and questioned democratic political assumptions. Many other writers, including those who wrote the kind of realist or naturalist works that we discussed in the last lecture, such as Zola, Ibsen, and Conrad, several other writers developed critical narratives about social problems that affected European civilization. And most naturalist writers, however, drew on European science to develop their descriptions of the modern social world. Other literary movements developed more radical cultural critiques of the faith in science, positivism, progress, and the ideas of rational liberalism. And such movements uh, also challenged university culture. We were talking about university space and university culture, and how uh, university universities across Europe produced intellectuals, and how there was uh, there were writers as well who did not go to the university and who were also writing radically new kind of stuff. So such movements, um, like you know uh, naturalism and symbolism challenged university culture, and also they challenged enlightenment traditions of rationality and reason. And rationality and reason and enlightenment traditions, these things shaped academic cultures across Europe. So avant-garde movements outside university extended earlier critiques of the Enlightenment and the ideas of writers such as Dostoevsky in Russia. And these writers tended to stress the non-rational components of human experience, and they also focused on aesthetic ideas that made art a kind of religion. So avant-garde writers expanded they can be seen to be expanding on the romantic ideas about the importance of personal imagination and experiences. So they saw personal visions, personal experiences as sources of artistic truths, and they even celebrated uh, the inner knowledge or subjectivity of human beings, of people. Such writers, such artists rejected or ignored the positivist claim that truth came from objective descriptions of the external world. And we can see this new emphasis on subjective insights by looking at its emergence in what became known as symbolist literature and poetry. This kind of writing suggested that reality is not simply what you see or understand through sensory observation. There is more to the world than meets the scientific eye. And this was a key theme in modernism in literature and the arts, which emerged in a late 19th century rejection of positivism. The symbolist movement represented an alternative to the literary naturalism of writers such as Emile Zola, uh, but it reached a smaller audience uh, than the novels of Zola and the plays of Ibsen. The symbolist themes appeared most clearly in the works of the writers, the poets that I mentioned: Baudelaire, Mallarmé, Rimbaud, and Villiers de l'Isle. And all of these poets sought to explore the meaning of internal rather than external worlds. Um, the origins of the symbolist movement and the emergence of numerous modernist literary themes can be traced to the work of Charles Baudelaire, whose dates are 1821 to 1867. Charles Baudelaire. Baudelaire was a French poet, and he was a poet who suggested that everything we see around us may be taken as a symbol for something else. Uh, there are no simple meanings. To reach the deeper truth of symbolic meanings, Baudelaire said that people must imagine or reorganize the fantastic or even the grotesque aspects of objects and of the real world, of the social world. And he complained that people living in respectable bourgeois society were unable to see the complexity of the world around them. Um, poets poets differed from other people because they explored the symbolic meanings of language and personal experience. And Baudelaire admired and translated the work of the American poet Edgar Allan Poe. He viewed Poe as an exemplary poet who knew how to use symbols and how to avoid the cliches of everyday language. Okay. Um, these themes that Baudelaire helped popularize were then taken up and extended further uh, by Stéphane Mallarmé. 1842 to 1898. Mallarmé came from a family of conventional middle class government officials, but he began writing poetry in his teens. His mother had died when he was only 5 years old, and his younger sister died when he was only 15. And his sister's death affected him deeply, and his memory of her became a theme in his early poems. So, uh, his poems are very personal sometimes. And he was fond of Baudelaire, and after reading the poems of Baudelaire and Edgar Allan Poe, he began to develop his own theories about how poems should convey complex experiences. But in contrast to Baudelaire and many other poets of that generation or the previous generation, Mallarmé did not live an unconventional bohemian life. He married a German woman as a young man and had two children. He was very close to his daughter, and he spent 30 years working as an English teacher in French lycées. Mallarmé's real passion, however, was poetry and the arts. And by the early 1880s, he had become the leading figure in a group of poets and artists in Paris. He even hosted a gathering of writers and artists at his home on Tuesday evenings for over 20 years. And he did most of the talking at these famous gatherings, and he often stressed the link between different art forms like painting, music, literary arts, poetry, etc. And he was interested in music, particularly in opera of Richard Wagner. He was also interested in the paintings of the Impressionist artists like Edouard Manet. Edouard Manet even painted a portrait of Mallarmé. He was interested in modern music, the theater, the ballet. So different art forms interested or influenced Mallarmé's writing, and he believed that each of these art forms could convey distinctive personal visions, and this was his view of poetry as well. So Mallarmé wrote poems that were essentially complex, and those poems were written uh, for small audiences, and few people understood them because they used intricate language and symbols. But we must keep in mind that this was characteristic of symbolism in general. French symbolist poetry was very intricate, complex, because the poets were using symbols to convey experiences. Sometimes symbols tended to get in the way of meanings, and they were of the belief that poetry must convey inner sensations and emotions in uh, in 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 a language that was very personal, very idiosyncratic. Okay, so the goal was to use the imagination and symbols rather than literal representations of external reality, which meant that the poet could not use the language use language in the same ways that most people use it in daily life. The use of language underwent a change in the hands of the French symbolist poets. And this new kind of language, the poetic language that they employed, which was not literal at all, which was essentially symbolic, this language described the internal reality of, and all of these were as real as external reality. Imagination, desire, the world of imagination were as real as external reality. Uh, for example, there is a poem called The Afternoon of the Faun, written in 1876. It describes a faun uh, rather a faun's vivid encounter with two nymphs, but it is never clear if the nymphs were real or something the faun imagined. So it describes an encounter, but whether that encounter actually took place in reality or in the imagination is not evident, and the poet leaves it at that. It's open ended. So the issue doesn't really uh, it, it doesn't really matter whether this was real or imaginary, because imagination is ultimately as real as any other reality, right? And poems are out there to portray all levels of reality. As Mallarmé described it, the goal of symbolist poetry was to describe, and these are his words, to describe not the thing but the effect it produces. So the goal was not to describe, was to describe not the thing but the effect it produces. The focus is on effect or affect, the influence, the impression of language, poetic language, rather than the thing in itself. And this theory was carried into other arts as well. I'll give you an example. Like Claude Debussy, a very famous composer, known to be an impressionist composer, he adapted this poem, set it to music, The Afternoon of the Faun, in 1894. Uh, and so there was a great interest that poets were taking in musicians, what musicians were doing, what they were producing, what they were composing, and vice versa. Musicians also took an active interest in what poets were doing. Not only musicians and poets, but also uh, creative people working in other fields. For example, the great choreographer Nijinsky created a modern ballet in 1912 for Debussy's interpretation of Mallarmé's poem, The Afternoon of the Faun. Okay, so if we go back to the romantic authors, they had stressed personal experience. Uh, Later, we find scientific positivists stressing observable facts, and if symbolists are thought to be stressing anything, it is imagination and personal symbols. In this view, imagination offers escape from a reality which is boring. It offers escape from material reality, and it also becomes a vehicle for expressing subjective visions. Some poets and artists viewed the inner experience as being more real than the illusory external world, and consequently, there was a desire to escape modern realities, and this led some artists to radical escapism from everyday life. Some symbolists turned uh, to hallucinogenics like hashish, or some resorted to alcohol to stimulate their imagination, their vision, but they often lost their poetry, and some of them even died young. And there were others who turned back to the romantic fascination with exotic places, and some of them chose to leave Europe for pre-modern cultures. Okay. Um, Next, we come to Rabo, who was perhaps the most well-known example among the poets of the avant-garde, and he wrote brilliant poems before he turned 20, and he defied conventions of the bourgeois life. He, in fact, fell into a passionate affair with with the poet Paul Verlaine, and he also wandered across Europe. Uh, Rimbaud wanted to show the poet's personal vision, which he which he managed to do in poems such as Drunken Boat, which was written in 1871, and this work tells the story of a boat that breaks free from the crew and sails off freely and beyond all controls. This theme of voyages, journey, liberation, and personal freedom was a recurring one in Rimbaud's poetry, really. Not only his poetry, but also in his life. He grew up with a religious mother in a small town in northeast France. His father, by the way, had abandoned the family. He grew up in a small town in the northeast France, and he soon fled from his, uh, uh, he fled from his writing and his life in Europe, and he stopped writing poetry after he was about 20 years old. So he later went to Africa for mysterious reasons and lived for more than a decade there in East Africa, to be precise. Uh, and he worked there as a trader and an arms dealer, and he struggled to make money, struggled to survive. So he turned his back to Europe, though he still corresponded with his family, and sometimes he even sent money to his mother, despite a very long struggle against her throughout his youth. Rabo eventually fell ill with a gangrene and cancer. He returned to France. He had his legs. Uh, he had his, you know, he had one of his legs amputated, and he died eventually in Marseille. Meanwhile, Rabo's poems had been collected by his friends such as Paul Verlaine, and they began to be published in the 1880s and 1890s. In his poems, we find the radical poetic quest for personal visions, and that is exactly what attracted attention to his poetry. But his life, which was lived very freely, uh, which was full of events, became some sort of a cultural legend. So his search for a reality uh, outside the social and cultural system of modern Europe, modern France precisely, suggested the most radical rejection of conventional ideas, and he represented the alternative to positivism and rational forms of knowledge. Um, and The way he described poetry, defined poetry, the way he lived out his life, created a lasting image. And Rabo once said, the poet makes himself a visionary. He wrote this in a letter, uh, and he added that the poet makes himself a visionary through a long and difficult rational derangement of the senses. These are his words. The poet makes himself a visionary through a long, difficult, and rational derangement of all the senses. Uh, So it is easy to understand that the goal of this process is to reach the unknown, the mysterious, the unquantifiable, the unknowable. Uh, and the attempt is dangerous, but even if he should end by losing his grasp of his visions, the poet has seen them, and it's worth dying for. That's what Rimbaud means by this. And the poet uses language to express what he has seen, what he has experienced. And that is why language assumes such great importance in the imagination of the symbolist poets, Rimbaud in particular. Um, Rimbaud's first, Rimbaud's flight um, from Europe, his freedom from European cultural milieu, and his account of the poet's personal vision had parallels in the plays of Villiers de l'Isle Adam, Auguste Villiers de l'Isle Adam. Um, Particularly in the play called Axel. Villiers came from an impoverished old noble family in Brittany, and then he went to Paris as a young man to become a writer. He was always poor throughout his life. He wrote plays, novels, and mystery stories, mysterious stories. He met Baudelaire and became a good friend of Mallarmé, and his stories attracted attention in the 1880s, but he was kind of plagued by bad health and died shortly after finishing his play Axel in 1886. The play Axel deals with the common symbolist theme, which suggests that reality is less satisfying than the imagination. Uh, the themes that we find in this play gave dramatic form to the symbolist emphasis on the superiority of internal visions and imagination. Um, Unfortunately, it did not have a large audience, uh, but it had a very strong influence in modern literature and art. The poet W.B. Yeats was very fond of this work, Axel, the play, and so was the American critic Edmund Wilson. In fact, Edmund Wilson wrote a book called Axel's Castle as a tribute to this play by Villiers de l'Isle Adam. So these were a few writers, few poets who were writing in the avant-garde literary tradition, and they collectively and also individually critiqued the positivist notions of progress, rationality, and reason. Okay, now we are going to look at briefly uh, the scientific tradition of the 20th century. Okay. Um, the critique of post Enlightenment scientific thought spread beyond various literary movements into philosophy and even into certain forms of science itself. Uh, it's important to look at some of the influential critiques and revisions of the positivist tradition, uh, especially at the works of Henri Bergson and his intuitionist philosophy, and Albert Einstein's special theory of relativity, which all of you are familiar with, I hope. And Bergson and Einstein challenged Newtonian scientific accounts of the world, though they worked in the different intellectual cultures of philosophy and theoretical physics. Bergson was a philosopher, Einstein was a physicist, but they both questioned Newtonian descriptions of universal laws, and they stressed the observer's role in the construction of all knowledge about the world. Okay. Um, and it is due to their contribution that uh, new views of knowledge and science began to undermine the earlier cultural confidence in objective knowledge and truths. Uh, the emphasis on individual experiences and inner perceptions that developed in the avant garde literary movements of the late 19th century can be compared to some similar trends in the intellectual spheres of philosophy and scientific theories. Philosophy and science differed from literature, of course, but these fields of study resembled various literary ideas in calling attention to the complex inner world that existed beneath the surface that positivist science had only described. And a new philosophical movement, represented most prominently by Bergson in France, stressed the importance of intuition in the search for an understanding of reality and knowledge, human knowledge. Meanwhile, a new scientific revolution changed important aspects uh, of the long-standing, long-established Newtonian conception of the natural world. The scientists in this movement, uh, represented most prominently by Albert Einstein, showed that Newtonian laws and conceptions of time and space didn't work really in subatomic and cosmic spheres of nature. Although the new scientific themes were difficult to understand, they became popularized in more general cultural redefinitions of time and space. The concept of relativity, for example, like earlier scientific ideas about the laws of gravity or biological evolution, uh, helped to reshape European intellectual life, and raise questions at the same time about the nature of truth and knowledge. So these influential developments in philosophy and science further challenged the late 19th century European faith in scientific progress, scientific positivism, and stable universal truths. Relativism began assumed the aura of advanced scientific thought, and the challenge to positivism in French culture gained philosophical influence through the work of Bergson, Henri Bergson, whose dates are 1859 to 1941. Bergson differed from symbolist poets and most of the avant-garde, literary avant-garde writers and thinkers in that he had a prestigious academic job. That's more or less the main difference between them. Bergson was appointed to the chair of modern philosophy at the Collège de France in 1900. It was a position that showed his distinguished academic standing. Um, he was born in Paris, but his father was a musician from Poland and his mother was English. Both came from Jewish families, by the way. And Bergson came into French culture from a somewhat marginal family position, but nevertheless he excelled in school. He won academic prizes and graduated with high honors from the École Normale Supérieure. He taught philosophy in various provincial lycées and in Paris before his appointment at the Collège de France. He lived more or less a conventional academic life. He married a French woman, and he was also a very popular lecturer. He spoke without notes. He drew large crowds, and he raised questions about the positivist orthodoxy of French life, French cultural and academic life. His lectures and writings mostly reinforce the symbolist emphasis on inner or intuitive understanding and appeal to non-academic audiences. He at one point of time he traveled to New York to lecture at Columbia University, and he later published a dialogue with Einstein on the meaning of theory of relativity. This happened in a very important year in terms of literature, 1922. In 1927, Bergson won the Nobel Prize for Literature, but by that time he had retired from the Collège de France because of health issues. Uh, Bergson was someone who could be called a positivist in his youth, but by the turn of the century he had transformed into a critic of positivism and the positivist conceptions of truth in particular, and he wanted to establish intuition as a form of knowledge that was as valid as science, and he often wrote with metaphors, somewhat like Nietzsche, and he particularly sought to redefine the meaning of time in his works. Um, Bergson's key argument, his main idea, was that the categories of rational conception, conceptual thought, do not really describe reality or experience as it is. Uh, Reality, uh, for Bergson, is a continuum that flows and evolves but never really exists in the categories that science uses to describe it. And according to him, the true meaning of reality comes from inner perceptions or from experience, not from external objects or categories, right? So this was the main theme of his most uh, influential works, like An Introduction to Metaphysics and Creative Evolution. In fact, in Creative Evolution, uh, he said that human life depends on something called the elan vital, which is constantly unfolding and evolving. The name of the book, Creative Evolution, uh, suggests, by the way, Darwin's continuing influence. Uh, Coming to Elan Vital, people understand this Elan Vital through inner perceptions rather than by the methods of objective science. They learn from their experience. Um, Bergson says that there is one reality which we all seize from within by intuition and not by simple analysis. It's our own personality in its flowing through time. It's our own personality in its flowing through time. These are Bergson's words. But this deep reality that Bergson is talking about is fluid. It is changing, and it is accessible only through uh, what he calls the intellectual sympathy that we call intuition, right? And intuition carries people into the inward realm of life where the intellect cannot reach. It offers a higher form of knowledge. Um, Bergson, in fact, illustrated the meaning of inward intuition by referring to the problem and experience of time. Um, Rational thought organizes time into seconds, minutes, hours, and days, and months and years. Right? Um, Clocks are rational calculating machines that measure time in this way, but this is not the way we experience or remember time, do we? Some minutes go quickly, others drag by very slowly. Um, breaking all time into the same categories, in fact, falsifies its actual nature and meaning. The true meaning of time um depends on the unconscious that experiences it. Okay, and this resembles the poetic conception of time. The conception of time uh, that Bergson came up with eventually influenced writers such as Marcel Proust, who knew Bergson and who drew somewhat indirectly on some of his theories. Proust's famous novel Remembrance of Things Past. It has also been uh, translated as In Search of Lost Time. And this famous novel, a rather lengthy novel, began to appear in 1913. It was clearly influenced by Bergson's theory, and it explored themes of inner experience and time. Bergson's conception of inner realities also contributed to a revival of religious and mystical values among some intellectuals, such as Charles Péguy, who wrote about inner spiritual mysteries. Um, uh, there were other writers who criticized Bergson. Bergson's critics said he undermined reason, but Bergson replied that he simply noted the uh, limits of knowledge that reason could provide. Okay, so his notions of the deeper realities beneath the surface of external appearances and his redefinitions of time um, had a crucial parallel in in the modern scientific culture. And now let's talk a bit about that. Uh, in the world of physics, there was a re-evaluation of the relation between external appearances and the inner realities of matter and light. New discoveries showed that atoms, which had long been viewed as solid, were actually composed of smaller particles, electrons and protons orbiting an atomic nucleus. This suggested that ultimate reality had more complex levels of fragmentation that than people had assumed. And eventually, scientists recognized that Newtonian physics didn't really explain the subatomic world, and the limitations of Newtonian physics became a particular concern of the early 20th century's most famous scientist, Albert Einstein, and his dates are 1879 to 1955. Einstein was born into a Jewish family in southern Germany. His father ran a plumbing and electrical company in Munich, which failed. Young Einstein went through school in Munich, but he dropped out of the gymnasium, which was actually the high school. He didn't really like school and uh, was described to be disruptive. He later finished high school in Switzerland and attended the Swiss Federal Polytechnical School, which trained science teachers. Einstein didn't get a teaching job after graduation. He was finally hired in a Swiss government uh, patent office. Um, there were several changes in his personal life, but amid those changes, he pursued the scientific research that eventually made him so famous and um, led to several academic appointments. He finally joined the University of Berlin and the Prussian Academy of Sciences in 1913. Um, his greatest scientific contributions came in 1905 when he wrote a series of famous papers, which eventually led him to win the Nobel Prize in 1921. Um, so, some of his work described the nature of particles of light, and some described the nature of molecular motion, but his special theory of relativity and his accounts of mass and energy became most famous. The theory of relativity appeared in a paper called On the Electrodynamics of Moving Bodies, which argued that time and space are not absolute but are relative to the observer's position and movement in space. Einstein explained that time passes more slowly as the speed of an object increases. Time on a spaceship, for example, moving close to the speed of light, passes very slowly compared to the way time passes on Earth. This notion, radical as it was, changed the classical Newtonian view of time as well as the meaning of movement, meaning of motion. The motion of all objects is relative to that of the other objects. There is no fixed motionless reference point. In another paper, also from 1905, Einstein went on to argue that mass and energy are not totally different realities. In fact, they are convertible. Mass can be changed into energy. This idea is a point of his famous equation: E is equal to mc square. uh, Energy equals mass uh, times the speed of light sorry energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. E is equal to mc square. This showed that a huge amount of energy could be produced from even small atoms, small amounts of mass, and this idea became the starting point for the understanding and creation of atomic energy and weapons. Uh, so, to conclude this section, the culture of the 20th century uh, eventually evolved in the scientific context that Einstein's theories produced. For scientists and non scientists who learned about it, the theory of relativity, as established in 1916 in Einstein's general theory of relativity, uh, seemed to question the possibility of final truths. The implications of both subatomic studies and the theory of relativity soon led to the Heisenberg uncertainty principle in 1927. Um, Werner Heisenberg was a German scientist who showed that one could not determine at the same time the precise speed and position of an electron. One could only describe its probable speed or position. And Einstein himself wanted to challenge this uncertainty and to show that some objective reality might ultimately be established. But Einstein couldn't refute Heisenberg, whose uncertainty principle became linked with relativity in popular 20th century ideas about the limits of human knowledge. And the arts, which we will be looking at in the next lecture, the arts developed similar ideas about the limits of representation. Okay, so um, we will stop here today, and in the next class, we will be discussing the emergence and evolution of modern art. Thank you, everyone.